Hello, I'm Jak Tichenor. Welcome to Illinois Lawmakers' weekly coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. We're coming to you during the month of May. Rich Miller of the Capitolfax newsletter joins us here in the House Speaker's Gallery. Rich, a lot going on this week, starting with pensions.
Yeah, this is really the beginning of maybe the end of the pension issue in Illinois. House Speaker Michael Madigan has introduced his own bill that he's fully behind, he's fully committed to passing in the House. He's predicted passage in the Senate, and that even at the Supreme Court will uphold it. The problem is, right, on the other side of the building here, the Senate President has come out with has negotiated a deal with the labor unions, public employee unions. It's not a deal yet necessarily, but they've come up with a package that he found quite impressive and credible, and he wants to take it to his caucus next week.
Could the Speaker's bill, which the unions would consider much more harsh in nature for what it does, could that be the Board of Education, so to speak, that got them to the table?
Well, there are two schools of thoughts here, right? It's either good cop, bad cop, right? The old game where Madigan rattles a sword and it sends the unions running to Cullerton to cut their best deal possible, or face really significant changes to the pensions. The other side of it is maybe it's like 2010. Where the unions were negotiating with Cullerton over prospective pension changes. Madigan got tired of waiting, said they're at an impasse even though they really weren't, passed his own bill, which the Senate didn't pass, and the governor signed into law.
We're in the first week of May. Where do we go from here before the end of the session on this?
Down. I mean, nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen. Right? There are two very distinct scenarios of what could come out of it. I assume that most Democrats would like to have a negotiated agreement with the unions. Makes it a whole lot easier. But does it do enough? And that's the problem. That's what's been holding Madigan back, because previous iterations of this did not save nearly enough money.
Could we be here on May 31st?
We could be here on June 30th.
And?
July 31st. August 31st. We don't know. I mean, the budget doesn't look like it's going anywhere right now. The Republicans aren't cooperating on it. Concealed carry is kind of caught right now. All the fracking, all the biggest issues you can think of are not moving. Now, sometimes the logjam breaks and they all move at once. Sometimes you end up in overtime session because of it.
Briefly, we did have some action in the Senate this week on gambling expansion.
Yeah, there was some, but this will be changed. That bill will be changed in the House. We don't know how much it will be changed. We don't know if the Senate's going to accept the changes. So, that's just a step. There are two other steps here, the House and then the governor. And the governor has vetoed a couple of gaming bills already, and he's not fully on board this one either.
It is still very early in the session, so to speak, even though we're here in the last month. Anything could happen.
Absolutely anything. In the past I've always said, always bet on nothing when it comes to the General Assembly, because nothing is what happens. And you're right about 99.9% of the time.
Rich Miller, Capitolfax newsletter, thanks very much for your time. We appreciate it here on Illinois Lawmakers. Up next on the program, we go in depth on pensions, gambling, and medical marijuana, among other issues. Things are starting to move here in the first week of May in Springfield as the Illinois General Assembly heads down to its scheduled May 31st adjournment date. Here to bring us up to date on the perspective from the Illinois House of Representatives, Deputy Majority Leader Lou Lang, Democrat of Skokie, and Assistant House Republican Floor Leader Dennis Reboletti of Elmhurst. Good to have you on the program, gentlemen.
Thank you.
The big news this week so far, and there's a lot of news being made, House Speaker Michael Madigan has advanced a version of comprehensive pension reform, similar to some ideas that have been floated before, but somewhat different from the plan that has emerged across the hall in the Senate. Gentlemen, what's your first reaction to what the Speaker's put on the table?
First reaction is the Speaker's trying to make an effort to solve a very important problem. The pension problem is eating up our budget. It's taking up a lot of our time. It's become a risk to people who are on pensions or want to be on pensions. But there are some people who believe the plan is unconstitutional. There are some people that believe it's unfair to workers. And we still have to work those through. There's going to be a debate. We're going to have to get to the bottom of it. But he has taken several items that have been talked about for a long time, a greater contribution by employees, changes in the cost of living increase, and many other things, and tried to cobble them together into something that we can pass.
It does resemble some of the ideas that have been floated here before by the House Democratic pension point person, Elaine Neckrits, and your own leader, Tom Cross, the House Republican leader.
That's correct. And so we're beginning to see a lot of these pieces of the puzzle come together. So one of the concerns I still see is that Senator Cullerton's bill, Senate Bill 1, was now the vehicle bill here that Speaker Madigan put this bill on. So we're still seeing a little bit of the ping pong back and forth as to what the final product may look like before May 31st.
There's not very much left of Senate Bill 1 as it comes over here and has been amended, is it?
I don't think there's really anything left. I know that the Speaker, at least in this bill, talks about his preamble of how difficult our financial situation is, and that we're at a crossroads, and that we're basically in a situation where we have to take some drastic measures and we may need to do some drastic cuts. And I think that's an attempt also to lay out some framework for the Illinois Supreme Court if it goes that far with court cases.
It's pretty clear that if this plan is successful, the unions who have a stake in this will take it to court, and the first 8 or 9 pages of the amendment lay out the case for, I suppose you would say, use of the state's emergency powers, Representative Lane?
They do. There isn't a person in the state, no one in the General Assembly, whether they vote yes or no on this proposal, thinks we don't need to do a pension bill. Of course we do. But there are certainly constitutional issues. The Speaker tries to lay out in his proposal these emergency powers to say to the Supreme Court when it eventually gets there, hey, this is an extraordinary time, we need extraordinary measures, you have to treat this in an extraordinary way, and I think that's the groundwork he was trying to lay in a similar way to when the United States Supreme Court received the Obamacare. And Justice Roberts, who everyone thought would be a no vote, was the deciding vote in favor of supporting Obamacare.
Some critics of the Speaker's plan, though, would say that the state is not entirely out of options in its toolbox of possible solutions. You can always raise revenue, which private companies could not do.
That's certainly true. In fact, I had my own pension plan, which takes the increment of the increase in the state income tax and devotes that amount of money to pensions on a yearly basis. That would clearly be constitutional, but there are many members that are not prepared to extend the state income tax increase for that purpose.
The Senate President, John Cullerton, has reported in the last day that the unions he's been negotiating with in recent weeks have given him a credible proposal. Now, he hasn't gone into a lot of the details on that, but Representative Reboletti, what do we know about what's surfacing over there in the Senate?
You know, I've had a chance to talk to some of the unions, the public sector unions, in the last 24 hours. I know that the official plan hasn't come out yet, but I think some of the discussion would be increased employee contributions, a freeze on the COLAs after retirement for a certain time frame, so amount of pensionable salary, choices between compounding COLAs versus regular COLAs. So there's a lot of different things that are still in play. Nothing on paper yet, so it's hard to figure out what's going to happen.
For the viewers at home, the compounding COLAs or cost of living adjustments are really where the big money is in this whole thing, Representative?
Well, that's the driver of this. And so when the pension plan was created many years ago, the pension plan says that after you retire, you get a 3% cost of living increase compounded annually, year after year after year. So after just a handful of years, you have a huge bump in your pension payment. And the question is, the backdrop to all of this is, can we constitutionally change that? Because the Constitution of the state of Illinois states very clearly you can't reduce or impair a public employee's pension once earned. The question is, can we do this? Some people think we can, some we can't, and then there's the issue of we're not dealing in this proposal with all 5 state pension plans. We're only dealing with 4. We're skipping the judges. I think people can figure out why we're doing that.
Are you going to end up in a situation where the House has one version, the Senate has another, and are you leaving here at the end of the month without resolution?
I can't tell you if the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House have agreed to what the Speaker is planning to do. We'll find out soon enough. I believe this bill will pass the House and go over to the Senate, and we'll see what they do with it.
On the Republican side of the aisle, what do you think?
I think that the bill will pass. I have some constitutional concerns of my own, having looked at some of the transcripts from the Constitutional Convention in 1970, which Speaker Madigan was a member of. I think it passes. I don't know if it has the votes in the Senate. I don't think it does, and I think we'll be at a stalemate, and then that'll affect how we craft a budget because we still have to make a pension payment regardless.
Casino gambling. The Senate, of course, has passed, I believe, its third attempt in recent years at trying to come up with a plan to give 5 new casinos to the state of Illinois, including a new Chicago casino. It passed out of the Senate. It's coming over the House. Representative Lang, you've always been kind of the point person over here on the House side on gambling. What do you think of the Senate bill?
At its core, the Senate bill is very similar to 2 bills we've already passed that the governor vetoed, but they did make some changes that were designed to satisfy some of the governor's concerns. Now that the bill is in the House, I will sink my teeth into it and see what technical changes need to be made to satisfy the governor, to satisfy some members of the General Assembly, the House, that would like to be able to vote for the bill. And I think we cannot turn our back on several $100 million and 100,000 jobs and the kind of economic development gaming will bring to our state.
Representative Reboletti?
I think I've supported the casinos in the past. I think we voted, since I've been here 7 years, maybe 8 or 9 times it seems like we voted on this. But I think it's important for Chicago to remain competitive, for the convention and tourism business to have a casino. We have people in DuPage County, where I represent, who travel to Indiana or travel to Wisconsin to go and game. So we want to make sure we capture those dollars and leave them here in Illinois and help take care of some of our bills here.
At the moment, we seem to be hung up on what version of gun control will pass or concealed carry will pass here in the House and Senate in the last few weeks of the session. You're a former prosecutor. How do you think this is going to work out?
You know, we have a 7th Circuit Court of Appeals opinion that tells us that we need to have something in place by June 8th. We have House Bill 997. Representative Phelps from Harrisburg, Democrat, has tried to pass the bill. We've come close, probably within a couple of votes. I'm hopeful that we'll get something done. But if not, there's always the concern of what we call constitutional carry, where if you have a FOID card, you can carry any type of weapon anywhere without any restrictions.
The Senate compromise that's been discussed in recent days is one that would carve out Cook County and the city of Chicago, that would give them a little more say-so in who carries it or not.
I'm not actually sure that's constitutionally permissible to have one set of criminal laws in one county and another set of criminal laws for the other 101 counties. And then it leaves people who can carry legally in one county, as they drive through another county, what do they do with their gun? How are they supposed to respond to the changing laws as they drive through the state of Illinois? So I'm not a big fan of guns, but I do think that we have to pay attention to this court case, and I do think we have to pass something. And then you've got people on each extreme, some people that are totally pro-gun that want no regulation, some people totally anti-gun who want a series of regulations, and we have to find a middle ground.
And this session, Representative Lang, after many years of hard work on your part and across the aisle as well, you've passed a form of medical marijuana legislation here. The highlights of the bill.
Well, we don't have enough time for all the highlights, but the bottom line is if you're under a doctor's care and your doctor thinks you need this product and he or she has tried other things, if you have one of 33 named medical conditions that are in the statute and your doctor will provide all of your medical records to prove that you have that disease, you can get a permit to purchase marijuana from a dispensary, all licensed, every transaction in a database. Law enforcement perspective is considered as well.
Representative Reboletti, you've been on the prosecutor's side of this. Does it stand muster as far as you're concerned?
You know, actually, I voted for the bill this time, and the bill was a lot more narrowly tailored than it had been in the past. You know, and I was a narcotics prosecutor, so I share the concerns of marijuana and the gateway drug, but we were talking about a certain group of people who have grave diseases and are in extreme pain, and giving them another opportunity to try to treat that.
Prediction time, how will it go? How will it fare in the Senate?
I think the medical marijuana bill will pass the Senate, and I believe the governor will sign it, and we're going to help a lot of people feel better and give them a quality of life that they deserve.
Representative Lang, Representative Reboletti, thanks very much for your time here on Illinois Lawmakers. We certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Still ahead on the program, we're going to get the Senate's perspective on this week's events here at the Capitol. And joining us now on Illinois Lawmakers for a Senate perspective on issues here at the Capitol, Assistant Senate Republican Leader Bill Brady of Bloomington and Senate Democratic Appropriations 2 Committee Chairman Dan Kotowski of Park Ridge. Good to have you on the program, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Big news at the Capitol this week. House Speaker Michael Madigan has advanced his own version of a comprehensive pension plan. A lot of parts of that probably look familiar to it. It's already been heard or voted on in some extent in the Senate. What are your reactions to this development, I would say early in May, but maybe not so early in the session?
Well, it's time to come, and we need pension reform. If we're going to live up to the obligations that we have to current state employees who have paid into the system as they were supposed to, we're going to have to do something to protect that. This is yet another proposal. Pleased to see it advancing the way it is. We introduced 3 subject matter hearings this week on proposals that Senate Republicans offered. I think everything will become part of the mix and hopefully become part of the solution that will resolve this issue once and for all.
Senator Kotowski, to a certain degree, this mirrors some of the bill that your colleague Senator Biss had introduced a little earlier. It fell short in the Senate. What do you think the fate will be for this bill, assuming that it passes out of the House?
Well, I'm very interested in seeing where the Senate President's proposal is going to be. I believe his proposal is going to be constitutional, meaningful, and fair. The reality is, I think our greatest concern is we want to make sure that we protect seniors who are living on fixed incomes, that we don't adversely punish them. But the fact is, we need to take important steps to make sure that we protect the system and protect retirees.
When you talk about fairness and constitutionality, the Senate President, of course, has taken the view that if employees or retirees want to have their cost of living adjustments, then they're going to have to make a choice. Do they want those, or do they want the state-subsidized health insurance premiums? For him, that's been the key to the whole thing in recent weeks.
Yeah, and I believe so, and I think a vast majority of us support that position. I mean, the fact is, we went through this last year on the health care, where folks have been getting health care premiums covered for life. That's not guaranteed in the Constitution. So by putting the choice on the individual, that doesn't unduly, impair people's benefits. And what it does do, it ends up saving us a tremendous amount of money over time, and also limits the ability of people to challenge it in court.
Senator Brady?
Well, I don't think anyone would argue that President Colson's idea of offering acceptance or consideration on the constitutional scale might be closer to constitutional. There are many of us that have not bought into the fact that that's necessary, that we can alter the system in the dire straits that we're in, protect what people have earned to date, but move forward differently. And the problem with the President Colson's plan of offering consideration is, does it really save enough money in that framework to protect what we need to protect, and that is the payments in future years to annuitants? Many of us would argue that it might not, and therefore we need to take a step that goes a bit further, proposals I've offered and others.
Now, we don't know at this point exactly what sort of negotiations have been going on, at least publicly. We don't know exactly what's been going on with a lot of the labor unions. They've been talking a lot with the Senate President and his staff in recent days and weeks. We're starting to hear that, of course, from the Senate President, that they have put forth a credible proposal. It's not formalized in a plan yet. Senator Kotowski, do you have any insights into what's been going on in those talks?
Yeah, I think what I think is, to getting back to my previous point, I think any of these proposals that have been put forward that we're talking about make sure that they're going to be fair, that they're going to make sure they don't adversely punish retirees. I think it's very important, something we weighed in as a group of people from the suburbs in particular. We're very concerned about that aspect of the plan. Now, what I think is good about what's been put forward in the Senate is the fact that all these different parties have weighed in on this. This hasn't been an isolated discussion. So when all parties weigh in, not everybody's going to be happy, but we're going to come up with a resolution that I think is meaningful. In other states, that's what we've seen. And that's what we've seen that's been productive.
Right now, though, as we start this month of May, when all kinds of craziness can happen here, you've got one proposal coming out of the House and the potential of another proposal coming out of the Senate that are at some considerable odds with each other. And we're here on May 2nd as we tape this. There's not an awful lot of time to get this worked out.
There really isn't. And the time to get this worked out has come and gone, frankly. Some estimate we're losing tens of millions of dollars every month that we delay this or days. And we need a resolution to this. I'm not sure where the Senate President's. We have a hard time understanding how you can craft a program under offer and acceptance and what the Senate President's trying to do that saves enough money. So we'll be interested to see what that plan is as well.
Well, I think it provides a great opportunity for healthy debate. I mean, that's what you have the Senate and the House for. I think we're going to be able to come up with a resolution. I think we need to get it done. I would agree in one aspect with Senator Brady said. We need to get it done right away. I think we have the opportunity to get it done in May. I'm very optimistic the fact that we're going to produce a result on this front.
Senate this week did move casino gambling, the latest iteration of that bill, out the door. It's coming back over to the House. Not a whole lot different from previously passed legislation over there, but maybe more to the liking of the governor and the Illinois Gaming Board.
Well, you're going to have to ask the governor and other people about that. I voted no on the bill. I had some concerns. Just getting back to the other issue, I wanted to make sure that the bulk of that revenue that was generated went towards pensions and went towards bills and education. There were some components of it that I disagreed with. Maybe the House will go through and make some amendments so it's more palatable to people like me. But I think ultimately, I think they addressed a lot of concerns that people had.
Senator Brady, where were you on the bill?
Well, I actually have a financial interest in a hotel in Danville, Illinois, so my ethics officers told me I shouldn't weigh into it. But I think the people who were opposed to it were concerned about the size and scope. People who support it were pleased to see some of the support for agriculture and horse racing. We'll see what happens in the House and what the governor does.
Medical marijuana has passed in the Illinois House of Representatives. It's going over to your chamber. What's its fate over there?
Well, the members I've talked to, I think it's got a good chance. I personally am not in favor of it. I don't know that we have the resources to regulate or police it. If this is something that needs to be done, I think it ought to be done at the federal level with the FDA. But if you talk to most medical practitioners and you talk to law enforcement, they're very concerned about what this bill does.
Senator Kotowski?
Well, I think in the bill, they've really worked over the past couple of years to put protections in place. The people who would be participating in this program have waived their rights so that the police can come in at any time. I know a lot of people have concerns about it, and they have concerns about it as it relates to marijuana. But I think the folks on the other side who want to make sure that they can get the medicinal benefits of this, I think they make a very, very convincing argument.
We're still waiting on action on a bill to regulate hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's called, which has to do with the oil and gas industry in the state of Illinois. The House Republicans this week said, come on, let's move on this bill. It's billions of dollars in profits, hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs. Seems to be hung up. Where's it going?
Well, let's talk about its importance. Last month, we lost 17,000 jobs in the state. Over the last 5 years, we've lost nearly 300,000. This is a bill about putting Illinoisans back to work. It not only would create jobs in the process, but it will also provide lower cost energy resources that will benefit Illinois businesses. And we need to move forward on this. We've researched it, we've debated. The environmental groups have weighed in and helped us create a safe bill. It needs to pass.
Senator Kotowski, there's also a call for a moratorium on fracking for another couple of years before we know what we're going to be doing.
I've actually introduced legislation to do that. So I have some concerns. I share what Senator Brady's talking about as it relates to job creation, the need to make sure we foster and boost our economic development. But I think in many cases the jury's still out about the potential environmental impact on fracking. I think it's important, any legislation. Now, the Sierra Club has endorsed a couple pieces of legislation, and one of them they endorse is the increased regulations, the heightened regulation, to make sure we keep people safe and protected. I think it's also, in addition to that we have research about the impact and what's happened in other states. There's been a lot of information that we've been getting about the negative environmental impact in other states, and I'm really concerned about that. I want to make sure any legislation that's passed includes that type of research.
As we come to the end of the program and the first part of the month here, we still haven't heard much about the budget-making process here in the Capitol. You're on the you chair the Appropriations 2 committee, Senator. Where are we at this point?
Well, I think what we're doing is we're looking at, as you can imagine, we have some really challenging times financially in the state. But we passed a law that requires the state to live within its means and to fund what works and get rid of what doesn't. And we're in the process of eliminating a lot of programs that are automatically funded over time. We have something that we've highlighted this year called Transfers Out. And we're not talking about local government distributed fund. We're talking about a series of close to 50 funds that have been put in place by through decades by legislators, which are automatically funded and automatically spent and not scrutinized. We need to evaluate those programs and see if we can plug some of the gaps that exist in our
Does the
state
Senate
budget.
have its own plan, or is it going to follow the House approved plan, that the model we've used in the last couple of years?
I think we're going to work with people like Senator Brady and come up with a good plan to
I
address
think-
the issue.
And we're very concerned about transparency. Our caucus is led on transparency and education funding. You know, the truth of the matter is this governor and this government has not lived within its means. We got $10 billion in unpaid bills. We've got to rectify that situation. And we're worried about the smoke and mirrors and how this budget's going to be crafted. We're willing to help, but we're not going to let this governor lay his financial failures at the feet of education. This governor called for a budget that cut funding for education $400 million. We're going to fight against that.
And we're out of time.
Well, I think it's really important to note these measures that I talked about were signed into law by the governor. They're one of the most comprehensive spending reforms that existed in the country, and we need to embrace them.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. That is it for this week's edition of Illinois Lawmakers. As we count down towards May 31st here at the Capitol, we will be back next week with another edition on the spring session. You can watch Illinois Lawmakers on illinoislawmakers.org or on Comcast On Demand wherever available. From all of us at Illinois Lawmakers, so long from Springfield.